Welcome to another episode of the Confessions of a Recovering Landlord podcast, where you'll learn the secrets commercial landlords would prefer you not know. I'm your host, Jan Gibbons, along with my co-host and experienced commercial real estate broker, Bob Gibbons.
That's me.
Brought to you by REATA Commercial Realty, where we exclusively represent users of office and warehouse properties. Landlords have representation. Do you? One key feature about REATA, and trust me, there's many, but one I wanted to talk about today is our LeaseTrac system. This is a proprietary system we set up years ago to basically track our clients' leases through the term of their lease. A lot of tenant rep brokers will just do the deal and it's transactional and they're done. They're on to the next one. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's not the REATA way. We like to be there with our clients from move in to move out to reload to expansion to contraction, whatever happens. And so we created this system called LeaseTrac that monitors all of that. And today I just wanted to talk about it a little bit and go over each feature and have you flesh it out. You're smiling. What's funny?
As you were doing that introduction, the term "till death do us part" came to mind.
Do we need to have a LeaseTrac on our marriage?
That's what we mean.
Because trust me, there might be more than 5 points on that.
Yeah, well, I bet. But, yeah, no, I was just thinking that I talk about the lifetime value of a client,
right?
And yeah, we want clients long term. We don't want one and done. But yeah, as you were doing that intro, it just kind of cracked me up. I don't know why that jumped to mind, but
I don't know either. I think we'll be discussing that later, though.
Well, I mean, the one other thing I would say before we get into the nitty gritty is that tracking their lease is definitely a part of it, but the genesis of this was that because I was a landlord guy for 20 years, I'd been a property manager and a leasing agent and an asset manager. I had seen so many times on that side when a leasing agent or a property manager would come to me with some issue and they would, briefly describe the issue and say, what do you want to do about it? And I would say, I don't know. What did the lease say? And it was really evident to me that landlords, particularly the leasing agents and the property managers, manage buildings as if all the leases are the same, and they're not. And so when I became a tenant rep exclusively 18, 19 years ago, I remembered that, and I realized that these tenants don't really, they don't have the expertise in commercial real estate. They do in their industries, but not in commercial real estate. So they need somebody to advise them, not just when the lease is being negotiated and found, the space found, but throughout the lease term. And back then I also had tenant reps who would call me up and say, hey, Bob, my client wants me to explain what you just sent them, an estoppel, operating expense, reconciliation, whatever. I don't understand how it works. Would you explain it to me so I can then explain it to them? So now that tells me that here you have on the landlord side, the tenant and the property manager and the leasing agent managing as if every lease is the same, and some of the tenant reps who really don't know what the documents say in the first place. And the poor tenant is sitting there expecting expert advice that they're not getting.
Hello. Can anyone answer my question? Well, and that's why we started with the lease brief, because nobody wants to read a 30 to 80 page lease. Nobody. Now it gets read, it gets reviewed, it gets counseled, it's negotiated. It's definitely a living doc that has to be dealt with. But to make it usable throughout the term of the lease, we turned into a 1-page lease brief. And it's got critical dates, it's got rent bumps, it's the rent schedules in there. If we have a must take or a right of first refusal, just high level key points, the
most important business points in the lease.
Right.
Yeah. And that's really, that's point number one. That there's 5 points of this LeaseTrac system.
Right.
And
that's what starts the LES tracking system, is that lease brief. Because
I
can't tell you
summary, LES.
Right.
Got to make sure they know what that means.
Sorry. Thank you. I can't tell you how many times a client will call or text me or email me and say, hey, what's my renewal option date? Or do you remember my base year? Or just something like that. They don't want to go through the lease to look up. I don't blame them. That's why I'm here. I'll pull up the lease brief. I won't even go to the lease. I'll just pull up that lease brief because, oh, here it is. And I'll answer their question and then reattach the lease brief and just say, if you have any other questions, let me know. But I've also attached your lease brief here because they've misplaced it or whatever. But that is so crucial. And that's what builds this lease tracking system. So that's just the facts. We have a little key phrase for each portion of the lease-track system. And the first one is just the facts. And that is when the lease brief is created.
Yeah. And the lease brief there are services and software apps for what we call lease administration that help to automate this. And they can get into excruciating detail. I mean, I've seen some of these things where the lease administration, and in fact, there are companies set up for nothing but lease administration, and they subscribe to one of those services, one of those apps, and then they physically do it as well. And they might even go as far as to pay the rent on behalf of the tenant. And they'll send the tenant let's say the tenant has 300 locations around the country, around the world. They would say, all right, you need to send over $5 million for this month's rent. And then they do all the disbursement. That's going to a whole different level that we're really not trying to go to, because honestly, we don't need to. Our clients don't typically have that many locations, although we're willing, if anybody's listening. And a lot of times the actual client, the tenant, will have some people internally that will do some of that as well. So there are different levels of lease administration. Ours is a very manual system in that, people will ask us, hey, what's the software you use for that? And I kind of laugh and I say,
it's a 10-digit software program.
It's Outlook, Excel, and Word. And they kind of laugh, but I tell them, look, I want it to be very pedantic and manual because, I want us to be forced to really think about this and interact with our clients on a very personal level, not have some sort of automated email shot out from some nameless, faceless app somewhere on a computer.
Well, and I want it coming from the person who's answering their questions every quarter.
Right.
Me. So I really like it because I send it out and I say, there's no changes, or you have a rent bump coming due January 1st. Hey, did that leak ever get fixed in your break room?
Right.
Or, whatever. I know you were thinking about hiring some more people. How's your space working for you? Were you able to get the dirt walls up or whatever they're dealing with? It's a reminder that I'm here, that I remember, and I'm in your outsourced real estate department.
And that's step number 2, which is called safety check. So the safety check is once we've signed the lease, we've done the lease brief. Now, once a quarter, you, Jan, are reviewing all of those with input from the agents who did the deal. And we kind of talk about what's happening, what deals have, what conversations have occurred since then. And this is one of the things that you do so well that I would not be as, adept at, is you're so good at keeping track of those things and bringing them up in that context in a very interesting way, playful way, and sometimes
Hey,
it's funny.
girl.
Yeah.
Well, it does. It helps because I feel like you and the other agents are the face that they remember. But that's what y'all are doing. You're out in the field. When someone has a problem, once it's done, they want to call someone who's sitting in the office, has their hands on the pulse and go, oh, I remember that deal. Well, let's look it up and let's touch it. Let's review it.
And accessible.
And that's what I like because they know I'm here. They know I'm on it. If I can't get the answer, I'll bump it up to where I need to get them answered. And the other thing I like is it creates a conversation between me and the agents where I can say, did you handle Jack Jones on this? He's still calling back on this. I didn't know if you touched bases with him. I wasn't in copy or whatever. And it's kind of a stopgap of nothing falls through the cracks.
That's why we call it safety check. Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean,
I ponied that right up there for you.
Yeah. I mean, that was a lob for sure, but yeah, so I think it's good. I mean, and one thing I'll go back to what you said earlier, which is even if they have nothing happening that quarter, there's no bump in rent, there's no options that need to be exercised. It's not the time of the year when the landlord does the reconciliation of the expenses, whatever, you still reach out and touch them because that tells them somebody's paying attention and it doesn't have to be me.
Well, and that's the other thing I like. It's the same name every quarter, year after year, year after year. Because in this day and age, I get hitbacks. I'm sorry, that person's no longer with the firm.
Yeah.
And I know that kind of stuff happens, but I don't want them to ever feel like it's happening here. I want them to feel like the same person I talked to last year, the year before, hey, they even remembered when they wrote the lease originally in '07. And the
Yeah.
other thing I like is I get to say, oh, I'm so proud of you to see how you've grown. Are you happy with the expansion space? Is it working out for you? I mean, I did that on an LES, I think for Christy last quarter, and she's got a client that's just booming, and I love it. I love watching it. I love seeing it's a medical service related firm, and they really meet a need in the community. And she's really found a home with helping them with exactly the kind of space they need. And so last time I'm like, hey, this is great. We absolutely love watching what you're doing and how you're growing.
Well, one of the things I mentioned earlier, which was an expense reconciliation, that's really when the landlord bills the tenant for operating expenses or their share of common operating expenses in the building. They may bill that throughout the year, and then they reconcile that at the end of the year and say, hey, we charged you a little too much. Here's a refund, or we didn't
I'm
charge
sorry,
enough.
say
Here's
that
some more.
again.
I know that
And with feeling.
that first part about refund is rare,
Yeah.
but that's really point number 3 of the LeaseTrac system, which is expense hawk, we call it. And so again, this is one of the,
Actually,
well,
number 3 is lease
no,
doctor on call. Number 4 is expense hawk. But
well, it really
I
should.
don't think the order matters.
Well, probably not, but number 3 would probably ought to be expense hawk. But anyway, regardless, since I already started talking about that one, I think that was really important because it's something that hits clients every year. And in fact, the landlord should be doing a budget for the following year, the coming year for 2023 right now. They should have already done their budgets, and they should be notifying tenants right now if there's going to be any change in the amount that they're going to be collecting each month. And then at the first quarter of next year, they should then close the books for 2022 and then reconcile it. Either way, they're going to get those bills or those statements, and they're not going to really know necessarily how those things work, how they are, what's normal in the industry, what their lease says even. And so this, again, is one of the great things that you do for clients, is you review all those things and make sure that those are accurate before the tenant has to even consider paying it or responding to it.
And the thing I also like about that is I always respond directly to the client. If they ever want me to step in and get next to their PM, leasing agent, landlord, whatever, I'm happy to, but I always give the information to them, and then they can go back to their landlord, and that puts their landlord on notice that they're a well-informed tenant and they have access to good information, good intel, and they're not going to get screwed over. And I like that empowered feeling, because it makes them feel more secure in their space. It makes them feel more secure in negotiating anything that might be coming up. And our favorite, of course, is anytime the landlord knocks on their door, comes by, they just say, how you doing? Call Jan, call Bob, call Christy. Don't bother me with anything to do with the lease. I am running firm ABC. You deal with them.
My favorite is whenever a competing tenant rep shows up at a client's office and the client says, tell you what, call Bob, call Jan, call Christy, call James, whoever. If they think I should use you instead of them, I'll use you.
Yeah.
That's awesome. More
I
people
love
should
that.
do that.
Well, and that it creates loyalty, which we're fixing to get to that on our 5th and final point in the lease brief.
All right. So I jumped over lease doctor on call. So my apologies for jumping the gun. So tell us about that one.
That's just any questions at any time. Because I always say when I send out my quarterly review, hey, you've got this, hey, you've got that, or hey, you've got nothing. But if anything comes up, call me. And I mean, one year I had a guy that he had a lobby exposure, granted, but the portion of the building that was his lease was not being properly heated. It was an office exposure. It wasn't warehouse or industrial. His temperature reading in his office in North Dallas was 41 degrees.
Oh.
And he had to send everyone home. And we're like, this is not sustainable. So you finally stepped in and called the landlord and said, you're going to get this fixed. And in the meantime, you're going to get some space heaters in here. I don't care what the lease says. You're going to have frostbit digits if you don't. And we did take care of that, and we got extra insulation. And I remember checking in with the client later, and he's like, oh, much, much better. Thanks for your help.
Yeah, and that's one example. Sometimes it's air conditioning. Like we've
Yeah.
had situations where a client, the air conditioning in the building went out, and the landlord, was working on it, but not fast enough. We've had situations where the landlords had to bring in temporary air conditioning, spot coolers. We've had, well, even like if the building's going to sell or be refinanced, then the tenant gets something called an estoppel. And so, it's a legal document. And so we review those for accuracy. And about 30% of the time, there are errors or inconsistencies or omissions that should be on there. So that's another example of things we do.
Well, do you remember when the big tornado came through Dallas about 2 years ago? And we had an office client in East Richardson, Northeast Dallas area, and it removed the top of his building, and water was just crawling down his walls. And we had to reload him in that building just on temporary space. I mean, like, move your computers overnight. Let's get going. Because the windows were blown out. It was a lot of work. That was a lot of work.
Well, and we have had another situation where a client's building got blown over in a storm. And so we had to scramble and find them some temporary space in a totally different building for 6 months.
There was nowhere to reload them in that building. That building was gone.
It was definitely gone. So, yeah, I mean, the lease doctor on call, that one, I mean, I'm always surprised. There's so many things that come up. I mean, it could be something, we had another client one time where a highway was being expanded, and the Department of Transportation condemned a portion of the land, and guess what? 10 feet of the building. And it happened to be 10 feet of the building where their office was. And while 10 feet of the building doesn't sound like a lot, it was a significant enough portion of the space that they couldn't really operate there anymore. The space was then too small. So we had to go to the landlord and start negotiating for relocation to another part of the property. And yeah, it's incredible the number of different things that come up that you got to go back to the lease for. You might need to get the tenant's attorney involved. Most of the time that doesn't happen. These are mostly operational issues that don't really involve attorneys, but there may be times when it does. I mentioned air conditioning earlier. One of the things that I tell people all the time is if you have some operational issue with the building, whether it's temperature or water damage or any other kind of thing like this, take photos, keep copies of those photos, send the copy of those photos to the landlord, to the property manager, whenever you, put in your work order or, ask for help, put that in there, copy us so that we know about it. And just, make sure that you're doing that. And if it's a temperature issue that's going on over time, you know what, get a thermometer in your space and keep track over time of what those temperatures are. And most leases don't give a specific temperature range that the space must stay within. But, if it's 80 degrees inside or more, that's a problem, or 41 on the low end.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't operate your business with that.
No.
You can't expect your employees to be sitting in there doing that.
Well, the other thing I like about this is a lot of these things we just named are outliers that a tenant might have never seen in their life. But we've seen all these things, sadly, more than once. So if something like this happens to our client and they call us, we're like, oh, okay, I hate this happened to you, but here's what we're going to do. It's not trying to use a friendly term here. It doesn't rattle us. We've seen it before. We know what to do. We know who to contact, and we know what the procedure should be to remedy it.
And we've dealt with it when I was on the landlord side and on the tenant side. So I understand it from both sides. I get it. I mean, we dealt with a situation where a building, a tornado came through Fort Worth and hit a bunch of buildings. And this is when I was on the landlord side. And so in that case, we were offering vacant space in our building to the companies and the buildings that got hit on a temporary basis, come in here for, 3 months, 6 months, whatever you need. And other buildings were jacking up the rents in that time frame to, kind of gouge them. And we didn't do that. We said, we're going to just be nice guys and let people come in on a temporary basis because they just need the help. So there's all kinds of stuff that's happened. We've seen floods. I hope we don't see any of these more, but yeah, I managed a building in downtown Fort Worth one time where there was this gigantic hailstorm, and the hailstones were as large as softballs, which I would have never believed had I not seen it myself. And you and I were together that night, and we both saw it. And our minivan at the time got hit by one before we found some shelter. But the 40-story building that I was managing in downtown Fort Worth got hit by those things, and it punctured the roof to the point that it was raining inside the 40th floor and going down from floor to floor to floor. And, I think our whole crew was at that building till like 5 a.m, cleaning all that stuff up, trying to, stop all that from happening. So anyway, so that's what Lease Doctor on Call is all about.
Well, our final point of reference on our LeaseTrac system is what we call Market Manager. And we do this to keep our clients informed of all market conditions to help them forecast costs, evaluate moves, and or add a new location. And like just the other day, I think we talked about this in a podcast a time or two before, one of our clients' buildings sold, and you wanted to tell them about the SDNA so that they could, be aware that their lease can't be disturbed during this time. Is it SNDA?
It is.
SDNA, MLB, NHL.
Hey, you're the acronym lady.
And I forget because we don't use that one a lot. But the thing I like about it is we kind of have our finger on the pulse of the news in this area, and we're all time looking out for stuff that is going on and letting our clients know, here's what competition is doing. Here's what happened to your building. They're fixing to do a major overhaul. You can probably look for rents going up, whatever. We're kind of keeping them apprised of situations so that, when renewal comes up, we don't go, oh yeah, you were paying $9 a square foot. It's going to be 32 next renewal. We like to keep them apprised.
Yeah. And this one actually, more often than not, this is initiated by the tenant, where the tenant's saying, hey, I'm thinking about opening up a new location in a new area, or I'm thinking about moving here or there. Like we have a client right now who wants to move to a different submarket. And so, that's fine. But I said, okay, are you aware of what the rents are there? And she's like, no, what is it? And so like you say, keeping them apprised of, so we, kind of did a search, and I think she still has a couple of years left on her lease maybe. But so I told her what the rents were going to be if she were to move there. And she was like, oh, I didn't realize it was going to be that much more, because it was going to be like 60% more than what she was paying where she is. And so we talked about it, and we found her 2 buildings in that submarket that she could afford. And there were problems with both. One, the landlord is bad news. And she talked to a couple of friends she has in that building who verified that. So we were trying to protect her from that. And the other one, the building was a very odd building. All visitor parking is valet, and she's a psychiatrist. And so some of her clients wouldn't feel comfortable, handing their car over to a valet. So that wouldn't work. But yeah, so, in dealing with forecasts, if they're thinking, hey, let's say they're 3 years into a 5-year lease and they're trying to do a 5-year budget. Well, that goes 3 years into a term that, they don't have a lease that covers that. So we might give them some ideas on what that might be. Not that we can predict the future, but yeah, we can come up with something that we think is reasonable. But anyway, so yeah, market manager is mostly the initiated by the tenant, but you're right. Whenever we see things in the news that we think is going to have an impact, transportation changes, widening of a highway, sale of a building. Sometimes it's even stuff like we notice that there's a sublease in the building, or we have another client that has a medical clinic, and we saw that the building that they're in downtown Dallas had just signed like 166,000 square foot lease. So we're like, hey, good news. You're about to get a lot more patients. And so, it's all kinds of stuff like that.
But also this kind of leads to something we had been talking about earlier. Of course, we always recommend you have a tenant rep represent you who exclusively represents tenants. And then the other thing we'd like to say is always use the same tenant rep. They need to know what's in your portfolio. They need to know your projection. They need to know what all markets you're trying to approach. And having that whole portfolio in one shop is just great for understanding everything. You can make one phone call and say, hey, compare this lease with that lease. You might be we have a client that has locations in McKinney, Carrollton, Plano. They did have East Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin. And if they want to know anything, they make one phone call.
Yeah, I think it's ideal for that to be the case. It doesn't always happen, and sometimes it's not practical. I mean, we do have another client who we handle their North Texas locations, which they have 3 of those, but then they have different brokers that work with them in other cities around the country. But hopefully they have one sort of coordinating broker who's handling
Quarterback.
Yeah, quarterbacking the whole thing. So yeah, like right now we have a client where we have they have a space in Plano, and then they also have one in Atlanta, and so we have space on the sublease market in both those cities for this client. Now this client also has space in Southern California, which we don't handle. So we would love to, and we've made sure that they know that.
Shout out.
So yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, having a broker that knows the company, knows the client, knows how they, what matters to them, how they like to do business, then, if I'm the quarterback and they have a need in Atlanta, then I go find the best person to help me serve them in Atlanta. But I'm still kind of coordinating things, quarterbacking things, and that really works well. So, this point is ideal if you can have one group. And I would say most larger company with many locations do give the assignment to one company. They'll sign a master agreement with a big company, and they handle all those locations around the country. And we have several friends that are tenant reps that have clients where they handle many locations for that company around the country, or even internationally in some cases. We endorse this as long as we're the company handling it.
Well, and what we want to say is if your tenant rep is not doing this, then you need to discontinue at that tenant rep and come talk to us.
Well, if they're not doing the LeaseTrac system.
If they're not doing,
yeah,
following you through the term of your lease, providing your lease brief, always on call, helping you with your expense recs, everything, just soup to nuts is what we try to do. Yeah.
I mean, we don't charge for this service, which I think is important to mention that, most of the time when you have a lease administration company that you're working with, it costs. I mean, I've seen some that cost as much as $300 per lease per month. And we don't charge for it because, we know that the clients need it. They need this service, but we look at it as an add-on service, and really is a marketing expense. I mean, it costs us real time and money to provide this service, but if we're taking care of our clients, then hopefully they're going to use us whenever they need to expand or open a new location, or their lease expires and they want to renew, or they want to buy a building, or they need to give a referral.
Yeah,
exactly. I was thinking the same way.
It's always easier to keep a client than to get a client. Not that we don't like getting new clients too, but I'd hate to think someone left me because I didn't provide the service they needed. I would take that personally, not just the loss of money, the loss of the client, but it would be a personal loss to me. I did something wrong.
Exactly. So I think this is a great service. I'm glad we do it. I don't ever want to stop doing it, and I don't want to automate it either.
No, I like that. And I have help now getting it done, but I still quarterback this department doing that. And it's, for me, one reason I enjoy the lease briefs is because the agents are out there negotiating the lease. And I hear about it in status every week and this and that and TIs and whatever. But until it's negotiated, I have the lease and a commencement letter, and I start to sit down and review and put the lease brief together. I don't really know what all you finally got negotiated. And the other thing I like is it's a second set of eyes, because sometimes you find something did you get the base year changed? Or, hey, this right of first refusal wasn't signed. Did they still want that option? It's just a second set of eyes, or third, with Lucinda helping me with it. And it helps us to know the client, to know what they got. And when they call, I'm not saying you're who with what, and you have what. I'm like, oh, hey, I heard that Bob put you in this. Are you happy with it? I want them to know I'm as well informed.
So is this where I say it takes a village?
Oh, no. No, this is where you say goodbye.
Well, the only thing I will say in follow up to that, I totally agree with you on all that, but I think it's also good for the client to know that if I get hit by a bus, their life, somebody else is here to continue to serve them in the form
Oh,
of
absolutely.
you, Lucinda, or, if Christy or James, if any of our producers, suddenly is gone, there's still other people that know what's happening and can serve them. And I think that is important. That's one of the negatives of, back when it was just me and there was nobody else in the company, that could be a legitimate concern for a company because it's a risk management issue. We have more people now, so we've grown 5 times since that day.
Woo, big dog. Thank you for listening. And just a reminder to send in questions to see if we can stump Bob.
Not going to happen.
We really appreciate your taking the time to tune into this episode. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you are on our YouTube channel, we would love to read your feedback in the comment section. Also, be sure to subscribe so you get notified when we publish new episodes. Thanks, and see you next time.